So to get started today, again, the topic that we're going to be dealing with is the healing power of stillness. My name again is Laurie Snorek, and I am a healing practitioner of Christian Science. All of what you'll hear today comes from my practice of Christian Science. And what that means is that I work with people who are relying on prayer and spiritual means for healing of any kind. And so I will work with people all over the world when they're really looking for a spiritual method of healing and thinking more about their lives. So in that vein, the topic, as you heard, is the healing power of stillness. And this topic has been particularly important to me over the past few years since I've been giving this talk. It really came about originally from a desire to really understand and find in my own life, in my own practice, a quieter sense of stillness within. And particularly because I think just living in this modern day life, my life in one particular time, on any given day, really just can feel like there's way more to do than the time allots in any given day. And because of that, to me, the practice of stillness is key and is absolutely integral to accomplishing all that I have to accomplish, or that many of us have to accomplish on a given day. It reconnects us with that sense of our being, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as human doings all the time, which can be very tempting to think about. But to really reconnect us with our sense of being and our sense of sort of true identity of who we are, as opposed to just what we do all the time. So that's kind of key for me about stillness, is the characterization of ourselves and thinking about ourselves in terms of how we want to be in life, in all that we do, as opposed to just what we do. In addition, the topic of stillness is one that is really about looking within at our own mental environment and learning how to maintain that sense of stillness in our own mental thought, and bring that to anything that we have to do outside of ourselves. There's a quote from a favorite poet of mine named Mary Oliver. And this is actually a little excerpt from a poem. It's called Why I Wake Early. And it's referring to the old poets of China. She said this: "Wherever I am, the world comes after me. It offers me its busyness. It does not believe that I do not want it. Now I understand why the old poets of China went so far and high into the mountains, then crept into the pale mist." Again, that's by Mary Oliver. And I love that sense of picturing these old poets of China climbing up into the mountains to find that place above the mist, the pale mist that really gives them that sense of stillness and quiet. And you all may be thinking about a place in your own lives where you go to find peace or stillness. For me, it can be being at the ocean or climbing mountains, or just sometimes finding a quiet space by a fire in my home in the winter, as it is here in Boston where I'm based. But when we talk about stillness, we're looking to not only find it in those moments of when we're off away from our daily schedules, but to really be able to find it in the midst of whatever it is that we have to do on any given day. And let's just start with a story that has to do with this. And you'll see on your screen now a picture of a cellist. And this is a story about a cellist in Sarajevo. So we're going to go back in time to 1992. And if you can picture with me the center square of Sarajevo, a man walks into the center square. He plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case. And he sits down, and he's dressed in full concert dress, as if he's giving a formal concert. And he starts to play the cello. And in the background, behind him, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. And this man, Vedran Smilovic, he doesn't just come this one day and sit there and play his cello, but he comes back for 22 consecutive days to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed at the start of the war while waiting in a bread line. Now, when I heard this story, it got me thinking about what it would take to have the kind of inner peace and stillness that would allow you to go out fearlessly into the middle of a war zone and play music. And I share this with you not because any of you hopefully will ever be in that kind of a situation of war, but really for us to ask ourselves the question tonight, or wherever you are, whatever time zone it is where you are, to ask ourselves the question, can we go into the midst of what feels like being bombarded on all sides of whatever it is we have to do on any given day, and bring a sense of stillness to whatever it is that we're doing? Maybe the bombardment is just of our own thoughts. And sometimes people say to me that they try to avoid being still because they don't want to deal with some of the thoughts that are coming to them. And so we keep ourselves busy. We fill our days with busyness and activity so that we don't have to think about some of those harder questions. But the stillness we're looking for, the stillness we're talking about today, that brings with it a healing effect, that sense of stillness is not an emptiness. It's not just clearing our mind of thoughts to be open to anything. It's really about filling our thoughts up. So emptying out, perhaps, of all of the racing thoughts, quieting our mental atmosphere, all of the racing things in our heads, trying to really put those aside, but then filling with a sense of vibrant, alive vitality of stillness, that it's a quality of activity, of mental activity that brings with it a sense of really being at peace with ourselves. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about what that looks like for us. There's a quote on your screen, now from a woman named Pam Brown. It talks about this sense of stillness. She says, at the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here, in this stillness, is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. Now, I hope in this passage you can feel that the stillness is already within each one of us. That as we kind of clear out the racing thoughts, that we discover there's this quietness in our hearts that brings with it a sense of confidence and peace and a stillness that allows us to let go a little bit of all of the demands on our time or all of the unsolved problems that would race themselves over and over in our heads. And that no matter what we're afraid of, or what we're worried about, or what we're concerned about, or all the things we have to do, that when we connect with that sense of stillness, it's beyond time. It connects us with that true sense of our own identity, of our being. And it has a healing effect in our lives. It changes the way we feel, the way we hold ourselves, the way the amount of stress we take in. It can change a lot of things about how we experience our lives. Now, there's an analogy that helps me think about stillness. And it has to do with this instrument, the cello that you see on your screen. And it comes from hours and hours spent in music lessons with my children, I have a cellist and a violinist. And the first thing they do in their music lesson is to tune their instrument. And it's the same if you are watching an orchestra. Of course, they always tune before they start to play for the night or for the concert. And this sense of tuning in, that there's, when they tune in a lesson, the teacher, the instructor, will put on a tuner, or in an orchestra, the oboist who will play, and it's a pure, perfect tone. And then the child will tune the instrument, and as you see on your screen, there's these little black knobs in the bottom corner, and those are the fine-tuning knobs. And when you turn those knobs, it brings the instrument in line perfectly with that pure, perfect tone. And what I love about this analogy for me is that, first of all, it says that there is this spiritual perfection. Sometimes I know in my life I can get caught up in this perfectionism, trying to find the perfect thing, whether it's a relationship or a job or a work experience or a house or a place to live or whatever it might be, that we're looking for kind of this perfect thing, or we want to keep our house perfectly or be a perfect parent or whatever it is. But sometimes that can really beat us up. And I know for me that perfection, to really understand a sense of perfection, is to hold a spiritual ideal of character, of being, as opposed to sort of the form that takes in life. That it's a quality of thought as opposed to an outward form in which it takes. In other words, the qualities of what home represents, as opposed to a specific place or a specific endeavor or a specific form and structure of a building, but it's the qualities that we think about and hold in our thought that are important to us, that form how we make a decision about something. So we're tuning in to that divine perfect ideal. And that's how we think of God in Christian Science, that God is that divine perfect ideal. It's a concept, that God is not an image of a personified man or woman or some kind of physical being somewhere in the sky or somewhere far away. That when we're tuning in to God, it's like tuning into the deepest part of our own being, our own self, the truest aspect of our identity. That each one of us is God-like. And as we tune ourselves into that ideal of God, that perfect divine ideal that is quality-based as opposed to a physical experience of it, that we're tuning ourselves in to our truest selfhood, to the deepest part of our being. And how do we do that? Well, and I'll just share one idea. So the founder of Christian Science is named Mary Baker Eddy. And she actually, I learned recently that she used this analogy when she was teaching her students. She often said, keep your violin in tune. That if your violin is in tune, there's no need to tune it up. Now, if any of you are musicians out there, you know that you don't just tune your instrument at the beginning of the day and then go to multiple concerts and expect it to stay in tune. You have to retune and fine tune your instrument continuously as you play it throughout the day. And it's like that with us. practicing stillness is a way of fine-tuning our thoughts to align with God, to align with that divine perfect ideal. And even if you're like me and you enjoy getting up early and having quiet time before the day starts and the phone calls start coming, or the children need to go off to school, or the dog needs to go out, or whatever it might be in your life, even if you enjoy that quiet moment in the morning, it's not enough to just have that time and then expect it to sort of stay for the whole day, at least for me, in my experience. That the idea of retuning throughout the day is about stopping in the middle of the day and just realigning, reconnecting with that divine ideal. And that in that place is where we find the stillness. And it allows us to relax, to feel rest throughout the day, to not have our day be about feeling depleted from the morning to the evening. It also keeps us from feeling at the mercy of our schedule, at the demands of others, or it keeps us from feeling like our life is purposeless and doesn't have a lot of activity and we wish we had more. That it keeps us being, that the impulse for our activity in the day, that stillness helps us to see that impulse comes from that perfect alignment with God, with our divine being. And it gives us inspiration and new ideas to work with, and it brings the quiet and the calm to whatever it is that we have to be doing on any given day. Now, there are two primary ideas that that form the foundation for our talk. The first one's from the Bible, from Psalms 46. And as you look at this on your screen, how many, and for those of you that might be listening on the phone or whatever, the phrase on the screen right now is "Be still and know that I am God." Now, how many things do you notice? How many directives do you notice in this phrase? There's two things, right? The first one is to be still. And then there's this sense of knowing that I am God. And I think that this is really key in Christian Science, that the being still is about what Mary Baker Eddy says here, that we hear God when the senses are silent. Being still is the quieting of the senses, not looking around with our eyes or perceiving or thinking or planning or doing. It's really about finding that spirit that puts aside all the physical senses and perceives with the heart as opposed to with the senses. That being still is about perceiving from the heart. And it quiets all of the thinking and the doing and the planning energy that kind of tries to fill our days and fill our minds. And as we put that aside and we just are being still with ourselves and just noticing what might be going on, whether it's, and it can be a feeling of sadness, it can be a feeling of happiness, maybe there's some sorrow mixed in with joy, but whatever all of that is, the next step, as we saw in the Psalms passage, is to know that I am God. And I think this is really key, because as we get still and we quiet our senses, we're filling ourselves up with a presence of God, with a divine power. And that this is, again, not a physical image of a being that intervenes in some people's lives and helps them, but not in other people's lives. And it intervenes for those that pray a certain way, but maybe not for others, and nobody really knows why. That version of God is not one that we follow in Christian Science. That this idea of God is more like a sense of spirit, a sense of love that pervades every little space in the universe, and everyone has access to it. You don't have to earn this love from God. You don't have to work up to it. You don't have to have a certain education level, a certain religious background. You don't have to have done everything right in your life or not made any mistakes. It's just like we don't earn the sun shining on us. That when the sun shines, if we want to feel the warmth of it, we just turn our face towards the light, towards that sunlight, and we can feel the warmth on our face. It's the same with this presence of God. That stillness, when we get quiet and quiet our senses, it's like a moment of turning ourselves towards the deeper, that the spiritual vitality of life that's always there, but that we often don't perceive in the craziness of our daily lives. And it's not until we either often are feeling ill or feeling super stressed, or we have a challenge in our family where we suddenly stop and say, oh my gosh, I have to realign. But what I have found is that as we practice that alignment, that tuning in to God regularly, it prevents illness. It keeps us from getting overly stressed. It allows us to hear good ideas that move projects forward that we may not have heard if we were focused on stress or worry or concern or other things. So we're going to talk more about what that looks like. There are 3 different parts we're going to cover. The first one is to look at stillness with ourselves. The second one is to look at stillness in practicing stillness in relationship with others. And finally, we'll look a little bit at the end about how do we think about world events and practice stillness in light of world events. These are the 2 books that we talked about just a minute ago, the Bible and the Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures book. And these are the key textbooks for Christian Science. And even if you've heard those 2 words, Christian and science, thousands of times, I like to think of them that the Christian aspect is that Christian Science comes from the teachings of Jesus. It's based on the Bible. And the science part, basically, for me, it says that Christianity gets its authority from seeing it practiced in life, not just from believing it on faith. Just like any lab science that you might take in high school in America, at least, that when you come to class, you have to have done the lab work for physics or for biology or for chemistry. You have to actually have worked out the experiment to see if the principle that you're learning actually proves true, or to see what happens. It's the same with the science of spirituality, that to see if these spiritual laws that we learn about, the law of goodness, this law of love being available for everybody, to see that that's true, it needs to have an effect in life. And that's where it gets its authority, not solely on faith. So that's a little bit for me about how to understand the science of Christianity. Mary Baker Eddy was the one who came up with this term. She talks, though, about Christian Science being beyond her time, that it was before her, it was something Jesus practiced, it was the science of what Jesus taught. And she simply put it into practice in her own life when she recovered from an incurable disease that she was diagnosed with, where she was not expected to live. And when she recovered, she spent the rest of her life as a scientific investigator of truth. She wanted to understand divine truth in a way that it could be practiced for everybody, that every single person could experience a sense of divine truth that would bring healing to their lives. And stillness was part of the way and the prayer that she identified and wrote about, and how it would align us with that truth and connect us with that divine truth in a way that would bring healing to all kinds of conditions in the body. She went on to heal many, many people. She took on students, and she wrote her book, Science and Health, for the whole world, not just for Christian scientists, but for anybody that's really seeking to understand more about healing. All right, so let's now get into the checks. So while I start to talk about this concept a little bit, go ahead and find your chat box on the screen. And thank you for those of you that have already found it. And as I ask you some questions, just go ahead and chat the answers in the chat box. And here's the question. I'll just give it to you while I'm introducing the concept. The question is, what does it look like for you to feel completely at peace with yourself? What characterizes it for you? How do you know when you're really at peace? What characterizes being truly at peace with yourself? So please go ahead and chat all of your answers into the chat box, and I will get to them in just a moment. You'll see on your screen a little spinning top. And this is just another analogy that I like for thinking about being at peace with myself. That so often I think we get, or at least I have gotten into this mindset where you think, well, when this happens, I'll find peace. You know, when I find my life partner, or when I finally finish this project and can go on vacation, or when I finally pay off this debt, or whatever it might be, when my children are finally follow my direction, whatever it might be, that there's this if this, then this kind of thinking. And it sets us up a little bit for the idea of postponing our sense of peace about ourselves and stillness. And what I find is that in those moments of stillness, we discover we are already at peace, that it's already there. We find the peace with ourselves that isn't something that has to come after something else happens, but that's already within each one of us. And what I find is that as we envision what that looks like, we can more easily practice it. So let's look and see what some of your answers have been. So, and keep chatting in. What does it look like for you? What characterizes for you being at peace with yourself? So some people said a feeling of being quiet, right? There's a quietness to it and a sense of calm. And I think that what happens when we're really at peace is that calm is undisturbable, right? It's a calm that even if something comes up that really tries to kind of throw us off kilter, we stay in this space of equanimity. I love this word, equanimity. I know we don't use it in the lexicon, but it's the writings of Mary Baker Eddy, and I love the sense of it just being a kind of this ability to be calm that's undisturbed, having the sense of equanimity within ourselves that keeps us from being able to react, from reacting to things. Good. All right. Someone said when good angel thoughts are coming. Excellent. So angel thoughts, that these are these inspirations that come from divine presence. And we hear them in stillness, that they come to us when our thought is a little bit stilled, when we're turning ourselves towards aligning with God. That's when we hear those divine inspirations. Somebody else said that when they're truly at peace with themselves, there's a confidence in God. That's great. What I love about that is it's not, you didn't say confidence in yourself, right? I think this is Heather. Thanks, Heather, for sharing that. That it's a confidence in this divine power and this ability for us to be in tune with that divine power, and therefore that we're confident in goodness, we're confident in possibility, we're confident that what we need to do in life is something we're able to do, and we can do it without depleting ourselves, without feeling run ragged, without feeling like we don't have enough, but really knowing that we've been given enough to accomplish whatever it is we need to do. Rose wrote that being fully at peace with herself means to not be shaken by anything or what anyone says. That's great. So that, again, it's that sense of like, that to me is like an equanimity again, like not being shaken by what other people say. She said a confidence, again, that word confidence is coming up. Thanks, Rose, for that. And I think that part of that for me is that when we're truly at peace with ourselves, we're not judging ourselves or others. We're not interested in self-criticism or criticism of others. In fact, we actually lose interest in conflict. That the human mind loves to pick out what people do wrong and kind of figure out how to criticize, and it loves to preoccupy itself with that. Sometimes it can verge into sort of gossip or talking about others. But being truly at peace, we're not even interested in that dialogue anymore, that kind of chatter, that we really feel a sense of just that quiet confidence. A couple other characteristics of being really at peace with myself for me is when I just find myself smiling for no reason, that there's a sense of joy that sort of overflows, as opposed to joy that's kind of comes from a particular event or some particular place, but it really just kind of overflows. And then I'm truly at peace when I can just feel that ability to kind of smile or be happy and share that with others, and it kind of overflows. And sometimes for me, that even comes in the moments of the deepest sorrow. That it doesn't mean that life is sort of this happy-go-lucky thing all the time, but that even in the midst of what might be disappointment or something really sorrowful, that when we're really looking to find that peace with ourselves, there is a joy that bubbles up to the surface, that comes forward, even though there might be sad things happening. Again, it's like that cellist. He's in the midst of a war zone, a very depressing, debilitating situation, but able to offer the music, able to sit there and be part of that harmony. That's what being at peace looks like to me. It doesn't mean everything works itself out in life. It doesn't mean the war zone stopped because he was playing music, right? It was still out there. It was still going on, but he was being unaffected by the environment and able to bring that peace and let it overflow, that joy. So, and just one other thing that I'll share, and then I'm just going to share a story with you here. And this top, I forgot to reference it, but the spinning top you see on your screen, what I love about this image is that no matter how fast it's moving, if you step back from it, it can look very still. And I think that, again, is a characteristic of being at peace, that no matter how fast we're moving, no matter how quickly we're thinking or how we need to be quickly responding to things at work or to our children or to other things, that we do it with stillness. I'm a really avid runner. And at the moment, it's winter, as I mentioned, here in Boston. You can tell it's on my mind that it's very cold out. So I haven't been running quite as often, but generally I run every day. And a couple of weeks ago, before our talk, the thought occurred to me, how can I run? How can I go out for my run with stillness? What would that look like? So what this says to me, again, is that stillness is not about being stationary physically all the time, although that can help sometimes to stop what we're doing and take a pause and take a break, really kind of clear our thought, take a break from our phone or our email or our work, and just take 15 minutes maybe throughout the day or at the end of the day and get quiet. That can be really useful. But even if we're moving fast, that we can do it with that quality of thought of being still. And another characteristic for me of being at peace with myself is when I'm willing to let things unfold, as opposed to having to control them all the time. And that can be difficult because there's such a need for the human mind to be in control. And yet I think that truly being at peace is relinquishing some of that need to control all the time. And I had an experience of healing with this, where I used to, for years, I had these reoccurring challenges, this reoccurring problem with my neck and shoulders. So I would wake up in the morning, sometime, just randomly it seemed, and I would have this really stiff neck, and it would be really painful. And throughout the day, I would not be able to turn my head from side to side, and it would just get worse. And I grew up in a family where my mother was a practicing Christian Scientist. She studied the Bible and the Science and Health book, and she taught us to pray for healing of any sort, to start off with that. So that was what I was used to. And I had started off with praying for healing of this condition, of this reoccurring problem I was having. But what I found was that it would go away, but it would come back periodically. And after a couple of years of this, there was a time right before the holidays when I had just the stress level was extremely high, and I had taken on a lot of responsibility for my family and my work and my household, to the extent that I just was really overwhelmed. And I woke up one day and had this really crick in my neck, this stiff neck, and I thought, oh no, God, oh no, I don't have time for this. This has to go away because I have so much to do on my to-do list that I need a healing right away. Let's go. So my prayer that morning was a little bit demanding. It was almost as if I was praying to this kind of like, if like I was the CEO of my life, right? And I was praying to this God that would come and like be my divine assistant to help me get this healing so I could move forward and have a healing, and then I could get on with my day. Now, I don't recommend that particular way of praying, but that's where I was. And so I really felt like I this had to get taken care of so I could move on. Well, throughout the day, it got worse and worse. And by the second day, I was really getting unable to move my neck and shoulders. And by the third day, it was excruciatingly painful. And even just taking a step would send these shooting pains up the back of my neck into my head, and I couldn't focus at all. So I had to sit still in bed completely and not move any part of myself so that I could try to avoid the pain. And I started to re-examine my prayers and my thoughts and what was going on in my mental environment. And what I discovered in that process was this sense of how I was kind of at the center of my prayers. And what needed to happen was to replace that with divine presence, with God and divine love and this power that was bigger than me. And I needed to let go of sort of a sense of responsibility. And the way that I learned this was that as I was sitting in bed and I was slowly trying to calm and quiet all of the racing thoughts that were coming to me and just get really still, that in the quiet, in the stillness, as I slowly let go all of the demanding and the frustration and the discouragement and the disappointment with not getting things done and the perfectionism that was coming to me and all of this, that I heard this message that said, I am the shepherd. Now, this is where you can chat in again. Go ahead and chat in the chat box. Just briefly, because I know our time is flying by here. But what I realized was that this message of I am the shepherd was about divine love, or God shepherding me, being the shepherd, and I was therefore a sheep. And what I'd love for you to chat is, what does that mean? What does it look like to be a sheep with divine love and God as the shepherd? What are the qualities of being a sheep? Because when this came to me, I realized I didn't really like the sheep. In fact, I was kind of biased against being a sheep. I was feeling really happy being in charge of so many things and feeling like I needed to be healed so I could go back to being in charge of all of these things. But what this message was telling me was that I needed to cherish the qualities of what it looked like to be a sheep with God as the shepherd, which of course is in the 23rd Psalm and is in imagery throughout the Bible. But I hadn't really cherished that idea of a sheep. In fact, I'm sure I had a teacher when I was young who said to me, don't ever be a sheep. Now, of course, she meant don't be a blind follower with your friends. Don't just do what your friends do. Think for yourself. And that's really good advice. But what I realized in this moment when I was sitting in bed that day is that I needed to cherish sort of good qualities of what it looks like with God. So I don't know if any of you want to chat in what you think those qualities are for yourself, but I think that the qualities of the sheep for me represented things like humility and a sense of obedience, a sense of listening more than talking, and sort of listening really deeply and listening to that voice, that divine voice from God, louder than we listen to our own thoughts. So I spent the day sort of immersing myself kind of in what these qualities of the sheep were and what it looked like. And so, as we're moving on here, just, think for yourself about other qualities. There's so many good qualities of this concept of being a sheep. And what I realized was, so I started liking the idea of being a sheep, but what I realized was that as we know how we're being shepherded by divine presence, by God, that allows us to be a better CEO, parent, director. It allows us to shepherd things more effectively when we know how we're being shepherded by God. Heather mentioned trusting the shepherd, right? That the sheep have a sense of trust. Oh, and Heather, you reminded me actually of something I learned not long ago, that the sheep will only drink by still waters if the water is really still. So they're trusting that the shepherd will find that still water so they can be nourished. And that's the relationship we have with God. That in the stillness, we hear that divine direction. And we learn to trust our own voice, which is really that divine inspiration from God. We learn to trust that more than we trust the things that the senses are saying, all of the racing thoughts and the planning and the doing and all of that. So I spent the day just immersing myself in this concept of what it meant to be a sheep with God as the shepherd. And what happened was slowly I could feel myself just letting go of feeling in charge and having to be in control all the time. And the result was that not only did I relax sort of physically and mentally, but all of the pain and all of my neck and shoulders was just frozen I couldn't move it without pain. It all loosened and just let go. And it's that whole reoccurring problem went away. But the reason it went away, I think, is because what shifted was my consciousness, that my prayers up to this point had really been sort of focused on kind of waking up in the morning and saying, good morning, God, here's all the things I have to do today. Let's pray about them so I can get them done effectively. And what shifted was a prayer that sounds a little more like, good morning, God, what do you have in store for today? And how can I follow that direction? So that, again, the impulse for life comes from that trust in that divine voice, as opposed to our own planning, our own doing, our own working it out, our own sort of thinking about things. That comes from the stillness rather than the busyness and the doing. And I think what I find is that we accomplish more in the process. That when we work out from stillness, we actually accomplish more than when we just are checking off our to-do list. So just to finish up this experience and to finish up about healing, and then I know we have to quickly move on to finish this in 10 minutes, but healing in Christian Science is not a problem-solving method. It's not about, here's my problem, and I'm going to pray to God and slap on some spiritual ideas or thoughts that hopefully will get me to a conclusion that results in changing my body or my mental state and reaching healing. It's not a problem-solving approach. It's really about putting off that human doing state of mind and aligning ourselves with what already is, aligning ourselves with that stillness and that realization of the relationship that we have with God. That when we do that, and as that relationship with God deepens and broadens, in this case, it was about sheep and shepherd that worked for me. But anytime that relationship gets clearer, it changes and it helps us. It changes things going on in the body, and it results in realizations about ourselves and our identity that change our health and change our experience. So even if we've been experiencing something over and over for a long time, or we're holding on to a specific concept of ourselves that includes a particular reoccurring illness or disease or problem, that when we get in that mode of stillness and we start to know God better, it redefines our own identity as well. And we let go of thinking of ourselves in a particular way. And when we change the way we think about ourselves, it just moves us forward. It changes the way we experience life. And so I had been feeling like I was so in charge of so many things. They were all dependent on me. And as that whole concept of myself was let go of, the challenge that had come with that concept left as well. And that's what results in healing. Okay, so that is thinking about peace with ourselves. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about was peace with others. And I'll just share with you, I have a funny little slide that you can see. This is to finish up the sheep and shepherd idea. There's a little cartoon on your screen that says, "You can't unfollow me, I'm your shepherd." And what I love about this is that sense that we can never disconnect from that shepherding influence from God. No matter, it's not outside of us. It doesn't come and go. It's not something that comes when we pray and goes away when we're too focused on work. No, it's always there. And it just is a matter of realizing it and turning towards it. All right. And before we go into part two, just to close off this section, Mary Baker Eddy said something that I think explains this a lot. And she said that to the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, "Come unto me. There remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm." Now, notice here it says a rest in Christ, and this is going to move us into the next section here about relationships with others. This concept of the Christ is an irresistible influence from God that speaks directly to our consciousness, that the Christ is this message speaking directly to consciousness. And again, if you are interested in participating in the chat, which is great, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'd love to know what it looks like for you to have the mind of Christ. What does that mean to you? As you can see on your screen, Paul, when he traveled around and did a lot of his teachings, he talked about how each one of us has the same mind as Christ Jesus. And it was this mind that is filled with these divine messages directly from God. So that's the question. What does it look like for you to have the mind of Christ? What characterizes it? How do you know when you have that Christ mind? And the definition sort of this sense of Christ is, again, the divine message that comes from God and speaks directly to our human consciousness. And when we're in that mode of really listening to that, what does it do for us? How do we know that we're living out the mind of Christ? So anyone, go ahead and chat in. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this and involve your thoughts in this. For me, the mind of Christ is, it allows us to not live in reaction to others. There was a time when I was a new mom, and I have two younger sisters, and one of them hasn't had her own kids yet and didn't have kids at the time. And yet she was so eager to give me parenting advice as a new mom. And as I mentioned, she didn't have any kids, right? So this became a kind of an ongoing conflict for us, where I would be doing something with my kids and she would be giving me advice about it, and I would react, and we got into this kind of regular relationship. Well, I had been really thinking about what it meant to have this mind of Christ. And I realized I wanted to hear those divine messages from God that would break this cycle of kind of conflict between us. And so as I was praying about this, she came over one day, and I was really cherishing the sense that all it took was to pause for a moment, and then the Christ idea would come in and would influence the situation. So the next time she gave me parenting advice, and I was thinking about this Christ mind, and I could feel my whole body like tensing up to sort of defend myself, about my parenting. And then I just relaxed, and I just thought about that Christ idea, and an idea came to me. I don't know what the idea was, but it was something, and it was funny because I said it and my sister started laughing. And the reason this represented the Christ idea for me at this time was because my sister and I at this time, we did not have a sense of humor. And so for us to be laughing together was extraordinary in itself. And it reminded me that, it made me feel like that was more exciting. I wanted to have that experience over and over rather than this kind of conflict that we've been having. And that's what the Christ does to us. It gives us information directly from God, as opposed to what we see in front of us. That other people's behavior, other people's mindsets, other people's comments don't have to determine how we think. That our thoughts come directly from God about what we see in front of us. Somebody chatted in, only value God's perspective, that the Christ mind values God's perspective over everything else. That as we look within, to hear that inner voice, that voice in the stillness, that's knowing God, that influences how we see what goes on outside of us. And that makes such a difference that we can get information about others and about our situation directly from what God tells us, as opposed to what we might see in front of us or what might be going on outside of us. So that's a brief little sense of, for me, what helps in thinking about how to have peace with others. And I'm going to have to kind of go quickly through these next couple, this last section here, because I want to get to thinking about the world. But just to summarize kind of the end of that passage, that when we focus on having the mind of Christ, it interrupts the cycle of reaction and allows us to get our thoughts directly from God, as opposed to what we see in front of us. So lastly here, we'll just close briefly, and thank you for participating today in this. We'll just close with this sense of, how do we maintain stillness for the world? And there was a contest that was held years ago for children. They were asked to draw what peace looked like for them. And the winning entry was the child who had drawn this rushing, roaring waterfall that was spilling over rocks and tumbling down into the water below. And right behind the waterfall, on a little ledge, sat a yellow canary. And the canary was pictured as singing. And what I love about this image and this idea of this little canary sort of singing behind the waterfall here is that, to me, what it says is that we never want the noise of the world to drown out our voice, to drown out that voice of God as the loudest thing that we know, that we listen louder to that inspiration and we let that lead us, as opposed to the noise of the world. And think about what that means for you, that this was what they chose to represent peace, was this image of the waterfall and this little canary, that represented peace. It wasn't about a perfectly beautiful pastoral scene where nothing happens, right? There was all this noise from the waterfall, and yet the canary was able to sing. It reminds me of a woman that I met once, and I was 20 years old at the time. I was in college, and she was giving a talk about living in Germany during the time when the Berlin Wall was still up. And she said that she prayed every single day for 10 years straight for the wall to come down. And this was so striking to me because I was 20 years, this was half my lifetime at this point in my life, right? I was 20, so I couldn't imagine praying for half my lifetime for anything every single day and not seeing direct results. So I asked her afterwards, I said, how did you persist? How did you keep going when you didn't see anything, necessarily happening, outside of you? How did you keep praying? And maybe some of you have heard this similar experience, but I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, the wall came down in a moment, but it wasn't the work of a moment. It was the work of all of those moments beforehand that were changing the thought. And when the thought changed, the result was the wall coming down. And then she said, Laurie, and what do you think changes thought? She said that every time she prayed, she could feel her own prayers chipping away at the mental blocks that were holding that wall up. And she said that's why she kept going, because she knew that thought was shifting and she could feel the thought changing. And then eventually the result would be the wall coming down. What I love about this story for me is that it says to me that any innovation in the world, any change we're looking to have happen, any particular thing that we might be praying about for the world, that it starts with the idea of thought. It starts in thought as an idea. And the result is the Tesla or the iPhone or the wall coming down, or maybe some new innovation in a small business that it results from a microloan to a group of women in some country, around the world. Anyway, whatever it is, it starts as an idea. And the way we influence ideas is through prayer and through thought. And as our thought changes, it shifts things out in the world every single time. And the results are what we see. And this is what Mary Baker Eddy says about this. She says that the best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action. That stillness is the model for human action. That in those still moments, as we get still with our own prayers, that we find that it results in the actions changing out in the world. So we're at the end of our time so quickly. It seemed to fly by for me. I hope it did for you. There's so much more we could have said, but there is space for questions. If you'd like to type in your questions, I'll stay for another 10, 15 minutes and I'll answer your questions, a few live and then also a few individually if you'd like them answered privately. But otherwise, I'll just thank you all for joining us today. Again, the topic today was the healing power of stillness, and looking at the way that as we practice stillness throughout our day and practice tuning in to divine presence, that it allows us to feel filled up with those thoughts from God in a way that changes and brings healing to our lives and redefines our relationship to ourselves and to God, which results in a healing experience outwardly. but that the stillness we're looking for is always a change in consciousness as opposed to a change in our environment. And sometimes for me, the hardest thing about stillness is just remembering to practice it throughout the day. So enjoy your evening and be well. And I'll now take questions, and I'll thank you all for joining us. There is one question here that I'll answer live. And then again, if you have others, please chat them into the Q&A chat box. All right. So this question is, how is this concept of stillness and what we've talked about today, how is it different than sort of spiritual-based yoga or meditation? So Mike, thanks for that question. And I'm certainly not going to be an expert on yoga or meditation. So there are many, as I understand, many different kinds out there. And I certainly can't begin to describe all the different approaches that individuals take towards yoga and meditation. What I can say about stillness in Christian Science is that when we get still and when we pause our lives and all the racing thoughts that we have to really commune with or sort of align with and sort of tune ourselves in to divine love and divine presence, that when we do that, it puts off and it lets go this sense of ourselves as mortal, limited, based in this physical body with certain problems or certain limitations. It puts off a sense of ourselves as defined by our hair color, our weight, or our height, or our past history, or our parents, or whatever, that it puts off these definitions of ourselves and allows us to fill up with this sense of our divine identity. And that is so key in being still, is the filling up of something. So sometimes I know in a very limited sense, and I've been told by different people this is a very superficial sense of meditation, but in a very superficial sense, I know meditation can be just emptying out thought, just getting quiet and emptying your mind of all thought. But what's so key in Christian Science is to not just empty the thoughts, but to fill up with that sense of divine love, to really feel that vibrancy of divine presence. And that is so key to this healing aspect of things. And that we don't just leave ourselves kind of empty, but that we are consciously aware that stillness is sort of a conscious capacity to understand God every moment. It's like unceasing prayer in a way. And so as we practice being still, the more often we get still, the more regularly that as we find and find that stillness that tunes us in to God, the more regularly we can feel that sense of divine presence guiding us. And I think that for me, it's a practice that's moment by moment. So it can happen in the car before I drive my kids to school. If there's traffic, it can happen as I'm about to walk into a meeting. It can happen before I take a phone call, that we're practicing that stillness moment by moment. And it doesn't require us to sort of be in a certain place or even physically be still or stopped or meditate in a certain way, but it's a state of thinking. It's a state of thought that we can foster ourselves. And so it's really, for me, about just practicing it moment by moment and seeing the way that it shifts our life. So anyway, those are some of the distinctions. And again, I think there's lots of different ways people practice this, but in Christian Science, I think the getting still piece is about being still and filling up with that awareness of divine presence, and that it has a healing effect on our lives. All right, anything else? Any other questions? If you'd like to pose any other questions, I'll go ahead and answer them privately, but I'll just thank you all for joining if you're still there, and we'll be happy to stay on for 15 minutes. I'll just turn off the video and go ahead and type and chat in any answers to any questions that you'd like to pose. So thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.